Welcome to our 5-part series, The Kabbalah of Love and Fear. One of the features of creation is duality. We've spoken about this a number of times, how everything tends in the physical finite world to be dualistic. Everything seems to come in groups of two. You've got 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 eyes, 2 legs, 2 hemispheres of the brain. We similarly have a perception of reality in terms of duality, up, down, left, right, positive, negative, proton, electron, particle, wave, yin-yang. It all seems to come in twos. In other words, there's some deliberate aspect of creation that wants us to operate in a dualistic world and with the duality inherent inside of each one of us. And of course the purpose of that is echad, oneness, to resolve dualities and bring them into a state of unity. And one of the most powerful ways that we achieve this is through our interpersonal relational context. Merger, joining, one, entering into state of love, appropriate love according to the relationship. And that becomes the most primary motivator of human endeavor, the way we love each other. One of the common denominators of all aspects of love is connectedness, joining. There is an equal and opposite, again in a dualistic world, polar opposite, and that's withdrawing, separating. We're going to talk about this toing and froing in an emotional context. We're going to have to understand what the nature of emotion is. But even before we go there in terms of the context of what is emotion, we have to understand what is the nature of consciousness. Because at the end of the day, if we don't understand the nature of consciousness, who are we that are talking about emotion and mind and the different features? Consciousness is something that the textbooks have discussed at length, and the one thing I found is that all the books tend to be mutually exclusive. I think most of the writings tend to associate consciousness with mind. And yet mind, in the Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah, is one pathway of consciousness. And emotion is a separate and distinct pathway of consciousness. And for a human being to be able to relate to another human being in a way which is able to create the fulfillment of life, we need to merge mind and emotion. We have to get together the 2 aspects of consciousness, join them together so that we end up with what's commonly now called emotional intelligence. The words emotion and intelligence, heart and head. And even then, it's not so clear, because the English language is not conducive to a clarity of understanding these things. Because English, as we know, is a bastard language made up of so many different antecedents. You've got Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Romance languages, the classical languages, and onwards, etc., Roman, Latin. So you've got words that overlap. You've got intelligence, you've got intellect, you've got mind, you've got thought. You've got all these things that are not clear in their distinction from each other. In Hebrew, because Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew, is a very exact language, a language that actually is the precursor to creation itself, as our Jewish mystics teach us, that Hashem created the world through the agency of the Torah. The Torah is the blueprint of creation. So that when we look at the Torah, and it looks like a scroll, right, that we read from on the Shabbos or the Yom Tov, etc., and it reads like a narrative and provides us with the do's and the don'ts of what a Jewish lifestyle consists of. But far beyond that, the shape of the letters, the nigun trop that makes up the musical intonations, the juxtaposition, and things like whether the sound emanates from the throat or from the lips or from the tongue, create groups of letters, 5 groups of letters. And all these are actually code-like mechanisms to describe to us symbolically the way that creation continues to take place. Now, somewhere there within what we call language, Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew in common parlance, we have the secrets of the nature of creation. Similarly, when we talk about mind and emotion, there are 2 very specific words that are used. The word for mind is seichel, and the word for emotions in our literature here is called midot. And if you know Hebrew, the word midah doesn't really convey the sense of emotion in contemporary Hebrew. It means a proportional flow, a measured expression. Because we're going to learn that mind has 3 energetic formats that become intelligence, and emotion has 7 energetic flows that become the state of emotion. The 2 primary emotions that we're going to speak about are called chesed and gevura. Chesed, usually associated with the Hebrew word of loving kindness in the more old-fashioned sense, but it's a sense of sharing, giving, and contribution. Whereas gevura is translated as severity, but gevura comes, you have the Hebrew word gibor, hero, strong, strength. But what is it that defines strength? What do we understand by the word strength? What happens to your muscles when you exercise strength? You contract them. So in other words, gevura is an aspect of contraction, whereas chesed is an aspect of expansion. When I practice chesed, I move outwards to embrace the world, to embrace the other in all different formats, through largesse, through loving kindness, through embrace, etc. And when I practice gevura, what I'm doing is withholding, maintaining within, limiting, measuring, focusing. So all of us have this duality, a duality that with our hands and arms goes something like this outwardly, and then something that goes like this. Every one of us possesses both aspects. The issue is how wise we can be in being able to balance these 2 tendencies so that they are appropriate to the moment and to the person. And that's where emotional intelligence comes into it. Having said all that, let's interpolate the words love and fear. What do we understand by the word love? Could anyone help me build a common definition of what we understand by the word love? Flow of good emotions, heartwarming, joy. So we've got synonyms, connection, kindness. Now what would be the common denominator behind all these? Good, that's the subjective element, positive feelings. But as was said here, the tendency is bringing together, bridging the gap. Here we are. You're sitting at the table, you're there, I'm here. Until we open up our mouths and speak to each other, or at least smile to each other, you are still there and I'm still here. However, at the moment that I smile at you and you smile back, there's already an element of coming closer. When we speak and then share of each other, then we're able to utilize our words as mechanisms for our souls to be able to draw nearer and nearer. It's interesting, when I was going to law school, one of the visiting lecturers in my final year of law school was a very famous English judge by the name of Lord Denning, who's no longer with us. And Lord Denning was a very a judge with a lot of courage to be able to initiate change in law. And he told us that he was going to lecture on the most important subject that we could ever study. So we expected this would be a lecture on criminal law, international law, things of major substance, and he says, I'm going to give a lecture on the law of privacy. Wow, this is the most major law, okay? And in passing, he presented it in this way. He said, if you get on to the Clapham bus, I assume Clapham is some suburb in England, and you see somebody at a distance at the other end of the bus whom you've never met before, it's very likely that you won't acknowledge them. And they won't acknowledge you. You're perfect strangers to each other. And that's perfectly normal. But what if you got onto the bus and somewhere on the bus was somebody whom you had a nodding acquaintanceship with? Then it'd probably be highly likely that you would nod at them and they may nod back. So you have already a level of proximity taking place. And what if you got onto the bus or tram or whatever it might have been, and you saw somebody who was a friend of yours? It would be very unlikely that you would simply stay away and not acknowledge. You'd probably go up and say hi and speak to them. And what if you saw someone on the bus who was very close to you, a member of the family? You might even go over and embrace them. He said, in each of these circumstances, in each of these instances, what you're doing is choosing to share of yourself, to reveal yourself more and more according to the propriety of the circumstances. And he says, the capacity of the human being to be able to choose how much of self-revelation we practice, how much we reveal ourselves, is the most precious commodity, because that goes to the core of relationship. So you have a situation at first instance which might be a stranger, and there's an element of gevura playing. You're locked within yourself. You don't make any attempt because there's no reason to. So under those circumstances, there's no reason to immediately jump up and down and go up to the person and embrace them. In fact, that would be somewhat ludicrous, if not dangerous. And therefore, we might say that if you met somebody for the first time in your life, and that person in the space of the first 1 or 2 minutes poured out to you the most intimate aspect of their life, you'd say, hold on, there's something not quite right here. The balance of chesed and gevurah is not taking place in a way which is wise. There isn't a wise expression of emotions. Yes, we've got the notion of boundaries, and the notion of boundaries is the notion of propriety. And I'm more interested in the actual dynamics rather than propriety. What are we actually doing when we reveal ourselves? What is the most prolific ways that we do reveal ourselves? So going back to the two consciousness flows, there are two ways that we consciously choose to reveal ourselves or restrain ourselves. And they are through mind and through emotion. Coming back now. So that's an expression, by the way, of consciousness. Where does consciousness reside? Who is the consciousness within you? Who is the ultimate I? Is it the I? So in our tradition, consciousness resides in the soul. The soul is the mechanism that provides consciousness for the human being, and all our wherewithal that we possess, which begins with mind and emotion, is the way that the soul navigates the obstacle course of the body in order to express itself, to reach out and touch the other, which is the purpose of life, that we each reach out and enter into a soulful encounter. That is ultimately what we live for. And whether it's with each other, or whether it's with the animal kingdom, having a pet, or whether it is with vegetational world, and our concern and care for ecological or environmental concerns, and entering into relationship at that level. Or with the inanimate world, the way we own and possess things and honor them notwithstanding. All these are elements of relationship. The most profound word that's used in the Torah to express intimacy of relationship is the verb lada'at. What's the verb lada'at in modern Hebrew mean? To know, which is rather strange. What's intimate about knowing? So let me ask you. If I were to ask you, what is 7 times 6? And you'd say 42. And you know, you said it. Cecilia, you said it without even thinking. You just said 42. You know your times table very, very well. Because you know it. What does it mean to know it? To know something is to be so intimate with it that there's no distance in between. It's you. If you have to spend time to work it out, even if it be microseconds, it's not yet knowing. In Hebrew, to know something is to be at one with it. Therefore, the first occasion that the Torah actually uses the verb lada'at, to know, is in the relationship between Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. The Chumash says, and Adam knew Eve, Adam yada et Chava. And you'd say, wow, what sort of language is that? I mean, they're treating us in a childish kind of euphemism. No. On the contrary, it's the most perfect word. To know something means to be at one with it, in the most total sort of way. Mind, body, emotion, and soul. That's why the verb is used deliberately. We talked about drawing together. We've talked about the nature of love. Love is the act of expressing chesed. We spoke about chesed as being this tendency, and what propels it is the fuel of love. What's fear? This is a little more difficult. What is the nature of fear? The result seems to be an opposite. You hide yourself. All right, so we agree, Laurie, that it's almost seemingly an equal and opposite tendency, right? That there's a strong gevura element to fear, okay? But let's ask ourselves, are there different kinds of fears? Let's analyze different kinds of fears. It's an awareness aspect, that you could be aware of what? Of the other, but why would you fear rather than love the other? Right? And their signals might be threatening. There may be an association with pain, and pain is one of the things that we recoil from. We practice strong gevura in the face of pain. Correct. If it's not a reciprocity in the relationship, while you are prepared to share of yourself and the other party is, on the contrary, repelling and rejecting that, there's an element of pain which results in fear in taking a second initiative or third initiative, etc. Okay. So we speak in the literature of two kinds of fear. We talk about a fear which is yira tatar, which is the Aramaic for lower form of fear. Yir'at tata'a in modern Hebrew. In my colloquial Hasidic translation, yira tatar. Tata'a. It's right there in front of you in your notes. Okay? And that means lower fear. And then there's a thing called yira ila'a, which means a higher state of fear. So let's see if we can understand this, because Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah make a very definitive distinction between different flows of fear, and loosely divided into these two categories. What we've been discussing when we've been defining fear here around the table has been basically yira tato, the fear of consequences, fear of things in this world. The things that we fear. We're afraid of fire to get burned. We're afraid of people who are threatening us, whether this be physically or emotionally or what have you. Sometimes we fear ourselves because we don't trust ourselves in whatever shape or form that might be. These are fears of consequences, of negative consequences. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's part of the existential condition of living this life. No question about it. The interesting thing is the contrast. What is higher form of what we translate as fear? And probably the English language doesn't convey this adequately. Yira ilah is probably best described or translated as a state of awe. A-W-E. Awe. Let's just stay there for a moment. What does it mean to be in a state of awe? Immense state of awe. Or let me ask you a better question. Let's go back and ask ourselves, have you ever experienced a state of profound awe? All right? Share with us. Oh, yeah, you've got a good memory. That's going back a few thousand years. Yep. Yes. Yes. Which probably... Absolutely. And I suppose that it wasn't merely the size of the mountain, because it wasn't a very large mountain, or it wasn't even the beautiful sunrise, although it probably was a beautiful sunrise. It was what you knew that Sinai represented for you, for your soul and for your people, etc., that contributed to that whole state of relationship to the moment, which we've defined as awe. Okay, what other... Anyone else around the table might be able to share with us experiences of states of awe? Like the wondrousness of it all. The most common poetic expression is the most beautiful sunrise or sunset. When you're alone, it's just you with that glowing moment, whatever that might be. Any others? At the Kotel, sorry. And what is it in terms of the state of awe? What words can you use to describe what it is that you're experiencing within? You become at one with the universe. Okay, that's an interesting term.
Or to see a certain sort of unexpected wisdom in the face of a neonate.
Okay.
Especially one side.
Right. So, what might be a common denominator here? The state of awe evokes in a person, and I think you came very close to it, the recognition of the absolute distance and yet participation. It's really an interesting contrast. When you're in awe of something, part of you repels, part of you steps backwards, and yet there's a fascination with it that locks you in to be there. But there is a tendency of backward motion, whereas love is a tendency of forward motion, or, as a fear, is a tendency of a backward motion. You know my rule. I cannot repeat anything whatsoever because I can never remember what I've ever said. Okay? It's the absolute sense of distance of you as a person and the totality of the experience. It's so overarching. It's so totally... it's even more than shock, isn't it? It's... Transcendental is a word that could be used, but here we're trying to convey the sense of that it is like you have no relationship to it, and yet here you are. Like sometimes, if I must share with you, when I was in the presence of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I had the good fortune of having a good number of private audiences with him, that's the experience I had, that I'm here, and I'm an absolute nothing, and here is a person who is a prophet of high order who sees through me, and there's no lying here, and what's the point of me trying to put on a facade or a front or what have you, and this is like huge. Okay, so that for me were always states of awe. But the ones that you've described are adequate also. This is yira ilah. In other words, a state of recoil. Ilah. Ayin Yud Lamet Aleph He. Ilah. Okay. We'll have to have a primer's course in Aramaic here. Okay. So now we've got two states of yira that we've defined, and it's interesting to note. Why do we speak about fear? Because the wise ones, the sages, informed us that our capacity to love God or fall in love with the radical act of living, to love the universe, is dependent on the state of yira, of awe and fear that we can generate. It's interesting that there's a correlation. You might say it in more common words like this. The capacity to love is dependent on the capacity for ego abnegation and humility. A person who is not truly humble, a person who's not able to tame their ego, is also unable to love. I mean, there may be either the pretense of love or illusion of love or self-delusion of love, whatever that might be the case. But unless you're able to enter the state of anivus, humility, ego abnegation, which we don't mean lack of self-esteem. I said this in a lecture last night. There's a huge difference between losing self-esteem and not being humble. Right? Ego abnegation still allows you to have a sense of self. What's the difference? The difference is like this. If a person is a haughty, proud individual, using the word proud in its negative connotation, if a person thinks a lot of himself or herself, then it's very, very likely that there's some tinge of insecurity. People only have to prop themselves up when they deep down suspect that there's very little within. So then they have to put on the camouflage of a front, okay? And that's usually a sign of insecurity. So that's why very often people who display this super confidence and over exuberance or what have you are really covering up things within. A truly humble person doesn't have to put on an act. In our tradition, a truly humble person possesses a healthy sense of self-esteem. What is that? As Moses personified it. Moses is described as the most humble of all people. Yeah, the Chumash says this is the most humble of all people. And I often raise the question, if he's the most humble of all people, wow, you mean dictator, general, chief justice, arbiter of all Jewish disputes? This is humility? The answer is yes. Because as the Midrash tells us, if Moshe Rabbeinu were asked, hey, Moshe, how come you're such a great guy? He would have said, me, a great individual? If someone were given the gifts that God gave me and was somebody else, they would have done an even better job than I did. In other words, what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, I recognize my gifts. I know that God gave me these. I didn't make them, though. I'm not taking credit. But once I've got these gifts from above, that means I'm duty-bound to express them. If I have leadership qualities, I practice leadership. If I have the capacity to create justice in society, I have to create justice in society. I can't practice false modesty and say, oh no, I'm not good enough. That's humility. But that person possesses self-esteem. Right? It's humility together with self-esteem. So here, when we're talking in terms of these levels of fear, the first one, the fear of consequences, there is a level of I involved. I fear consequences. And it may be quite legitimate. Because things that happen in the world, even for spiritual people, physical things are real. You can't practice spirituality if you're not going to be a healthy individual who looks after himself or herself health-wise and physical-wise, etc. To be spiritual doesn't mean to become an ascetic, although there have been groups in different religious lines where asceticism is practiced. Okay? Self-denial. That's not a Jewish way, even though there were, within Jewish history, some ascetic groups. But it's highly undesirable. Asceticism is not asceticism, the kind of notion of self-denial, deprive yourself of food, keep fasting, deprive yourself of clothing, keep very poor clothing. I may have shared this little joke before. You know, we Hasidim often make jokes at the expense of another group or line within Jewish teachings that practices ethical codes of behavior, called the Musar movement, which is a very, very wonderful evolution in Jewish teachings that makes the person practice humility. But it's not the Hasidic way. And the reason is as follows, you'll see with the story. So let me take you to one of the Musar schools of the days of old. Okay? And here we find ourselves in this particular Musar school of Novorodok. And there they have a room which teacher and student has to enter into every day to practice humility. How do they do it? Watch these two teachers. They come into the room and they begin their affirmations. I'm nothing. I'm really nothing. Ich bin gar nicht. I'm an absolute nothing. And so they go on for half an hour, making sure that they're practicing their nothingness, which is good. That means you have a sense of humility, the greatness of the world. Two little students come in. When I say little, we're talking about yeshiva students. They're in their late teens. And they too have to start practicing. So they come in and they start. I'm nothing. I'm really nothing. I'm an absolute nothing. And one of the teachers nudges the other teacher and says, huh, and he already thinks he's a nothing. You can become so absorbed in practicing humility that your ego rises and rises and rises. Okay? It's tricky business to practice true humility. Okay? Fine. So asceticism and self-denial is not necessarily our way. Okay. So now we have another duality that impinges on this. What makes love right or wrong, and what makes fear right or wrong? Just because it's love doesn't make it right, and just because it's fear doesn't make it right. So we have another duality within. And that duality is called Nefesh Bahamit and Nefesh Elokit. Nefesh Bahamis and Nefesh Elokis, which loosely translates the animalistic side of self and the godly side of self, but put in a more practical expression in terms of our own experience, it means the ego self, self-centeredness, and the selfless self, other-centeredness. Every one of us here at the table has these two tendencies. We have a tendency to take care of ourselves. Food, clothing, shelter, etc. As Maslow says, that's fine. That's okay, no, keep going. It's fine. It's fine. It's beautiful music there. So, no, keep going. You've got to have your coffee, I know you. So, we have those 10, food, clothing, and shelter. Okay. Food, clothing, and shelter is what the Nefesh Bahamis does. It says, you're in this world, it's a finite physical world, and you have to live physically in order to survive. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Would anyone argue that we shouldn't eat, that we shouldn't dress, that we shouldn't have a roof over our head? And that's the Nefesh Bahamis. Then we have a part of us that says, now hold on, you don't have to think about yourself. Why don't you think about others? Why don't you think about the otherness of existence? A life of service, a life of contribution, a life of being able to carry out what Hashem wants from us, etc. The Nefesh Elokis is much more divine in its goals and orientations. So you've got these two aspects, competing aspects within, and they are truly competing, as we shall see. Now, having these two aspects, I haven't yet suggested that there's anything negative or bad. Both seem to be carrying out a function. One is a very prosaic physical function, and the other one is a much more sublime spiritual function. Nothing wrong so far. Until we get to understand the Nefesh Bahamis a little bit better. See, whereas the Nefesh Bahamis wants food, clothing and shelter, it also doesn't know when to stop. How much food? How much clothing? How much shelter? Food? Well, I will not sit down to eat unless it's haute cuisine. Clothing? Nothing will be on my body unless it's designer label. Shelter? I have to have a chandelier in the lounge room and in the toilet. In other words, what the nature of the Nefesh Bahamis is to seek self-aggrandizement more and more. Physical subsistence, but far beyond. It doesn't know when to stop. Comes along the other side of self, the Nefesh Elokis, and the Nefesh Elokis has standards, has the values, is connected to the Godhead. And it says, so to speak, to the Nefesh Bahamis, if we're wise, enough. Stop there. You've got enough to survive. Now turn your energy and attention to help being a co-creator of the unfinished universe. Now let's apply it to love and fear. You can love someone in a very positive way, and you therefore want to serve that person, you want to give of yourself to the person emotionally, tangibly, you want to be able to provide goods and services to that person, you want to be able to nurture the person, etc. Then there's a love that may be smothering. You love the person too much. Maybe you love the person too much because you need to love the person. Not because it's appropriate love, but it satisfies your need. Maybe you're conferring love on the person because you really want it back. That you really want it reciprocated. You need the other person's love. See how subtle it is? Here now you're finding situations of love that are self-serving and not truly altruistic. A very fine distinction, and yet a very important one, because one actually flows through the Nefesh Bahamis. It's all about me, my needs, what I want, even though it comes out as apparent love. And the other one is truly from Nefesh Elokis, truly serving the other. So you've got this dynamic that impinges on the two. Likewise, in terms of fear. You've got the capacity to express fear through both dimensions. You can be afraid of a circumstance. Why? Because I'm going to be made to look stupid. So that is a fear of a consequence that flows from the Nefesh Bahamis. Or, I fear for my child playing with fire because the child can hurt itself. That's obviously flowing from a different place. It's nothing to do with self. It's absolute concern for the other. So you can see how the emotions are mediated by these two spiritual tendencies. And it's also important to understand that. So now we're discovering how Chassidus is psychologically analyzing the person in greater complexity. And that's unfortunately because we are complex. We are not simple. That's how psychologists and psychiatrists make a living. Otherwise we'd be all very simple all round. Okay? So we have a higher self, we have a lower self. We mediate emotion through both areas. But how do we shape emotions? How do we know when an emotion is right or an emotion is wrong? And I used an important verb then. Know. How do I know? That's when mind starts to enter into the picture. In order for something to be right or wrong requires the compass bearing of the antenna of mind. If you don't use your head, the emotions may go all over the place wrongly. You know, it's like the father is a physicist, and his 5-year-old child he has great ambitions for. He wants his child to become an Einstein. And at the age of 5 he decides this is the moment. And he takes the child and puts on screen these wonderful equations of E equals mc squared and all the different theories that came and all the numbering and and the child listens there watching this for 1 hour, and after that doesn't want to have a bar of physics ever again. The father meant the best. The father loves the child and therefore is ambitious for the child. But the father was not wise. The father didn't create the right compass bearing. And as a consequence, the loving repose didn't hit its mark. However, if he would have said, and say we're not about a 5-year-old child, let's say we're talking about a 16-year-old who is equally lacking knowledge of any physics or math. And the teacher says, now I understand you don't know any physics or maths, but I'll tell you what Einstein taught about relativity. He said this. He said, if you're sitting on a couch with your girlfriend for 1 hour, it'll feel like a mere 5 minutes. But if you're sitting on a very hot stove for 5 minutes, it'll feel like the full hour. Theory of relativity. There you are. You sort of pique the interest of the individual. You're not trying to sort of show the absolute complexity of a theory. You're moving into the mind of the individual because you love the student. You want the student to be able to come out of its shell and understanding something profound, but you do it in a way which is measured. Mind has defined the nature of the flow of the emotions, and that's called moach shalit al halev. That the mind determines the outflow of the emotions. Okay, that gets us to love, which the rest of the series is going to deal with primarily. But we needed to go through this background to have a bit of an understanding of love vis-a-vis its opposite, to have an understanding of the duality within that mediates it. And now let's go to an analysis of love. And we're going to, over the next several weeks, go through various formats of love. Firstly, in talking about love, Kabbalah speaks about 2 levels of love. You have a level of love that's called Ahava Rabbah, and you have a level of love that's called Ahavat Olam. One literally translates as the great love, and the other one translates as love of the world. Let's have a look. What could each of these be? As you see, we've moved to the second page now in our discussion. Let's talk about the lower love first. The lower love, and it's not a low love as you'll see, it's something extremely profound, is the love that's born of a profound consideration and contemplation of the inner and outer beauty of the other. You know, it says in the Talmud that every bridegroom always sees his bride as the most beautiful woman in the world. And to that extent, it said that every guest that comes to the wedding must reinforce for the bridegroom that belief. Now, does it mean that she's going to win every beauty contest? Probably unlikely. But nevertheless, there is that beauty in the bridegroom's eye. What does that mean? And hopefully it's vice versa. Okay? Most handsome groom that ever could be. What is it? Why does a person say that? Because we're not talking about a measure of beauty that's skin deep. We're talking about an expression of relational depth. A beauty that goes to the very core and soul of the individual. And when you do it through consideration, this is the most wonderful person I've ever met. And look how gracious she is, and look how caring she is, and look how sensitive she is. And you consider all the wonderful marvels, which, by the way, every husband should consider at least once a week about his wife, and vice versa, and that way we would have much less marriage breakdown than we have. That's an expression of love. And yet this is called Ahavat Olam. Ahavat Olam, the lower form of love. Isn't it something profound that we've enunciated? And yet we're describing this as the lower form of love. And it's interesting. What could possibly be the higher form of love? Ahava Rabbah. So we're told that that kind of love, Ahava Rabbah, which you'll find back on the first page there, is the kind of love that we cannot, through mere contemplation, consideration, meditation, focusing, ever arrive at. That singular individuals have been gifted from above to have this profound state of love called Ahava Rabbah, which perhaps around this table, well, I'll speak for myself, we haven't experienced. It's an ecstasy of states of unity and oneness where you see everything constantly in a state of that unity and oneness. Constantly, like it used to say about the Rebbeim. The Rebbeim would look at a table and they wouldn't see a table. They'd see the spiritual connection of the subterranean spiritual forces that make up the energy of the table into matter, and its connectedness to God. That requires a gift from above. So it's not something we should even aspire to. Because to aspire, it's interesting. Let me just momentarily go sideways. Whereas in some Eastern traditions, they aspire to be an expression of the perfect Buddha. Right? Perfection. In our tradition, we don't seek that. The name of the text from which this material that we're discussing tonight evolves from is Sefer Tanya, the book of Tanya, in chapter 43 of the first section we're dealing with. But the other name for that text is called Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the intermediates, the in-betweeners. And the Alter Rebbe who authored it says that's what we should aspire to. We should aspire to be the intermediate person, not the perfect master, which is rather strange. Should we not set our sights high and try to become the perfect master? Okay, if we only get there halfway, well and good. And the answer is no. To try to aspire to be the perfect master, says the Alter Rebbe, is the height of egotism. I aspire to be the perfect master. There's a certain aspect that grates against humility and a sense of reality about that. So the Alter Rebbe says, no. What you need to do is to aspire to be the in-betweener. But hold on, what does an in-betweener mean? In-betweener suggests, okay, you get a 50% pass mark in life. 50% of the time you get things right, and 50% of the time you get things wrong. That's what the suggestion might be. No, says the Alter Rebbe, that's not who I call the in-betweener. The perfect master is the individual who no longer has any level of temptation whatsoever, always has perfect thought, perfect speech, and perfect behavior. That's the perfect master. Okay? What's the in-betweener? The in-betweener has always perfect speech and perfect behavior. Is there a difference? I didn't say perfect thought. In other words, the Beinoni, the in-betweener, is constantly tested, is constantly aware of temptation, constantly understanding the negativities of life and the problem of adjusting to overcome them. But, says the Alter Rebbe, the Mr. In-betweener, the Beinoni, passes every test. The difference between the perfect master, the tzaddik, and the Beinoni is that the tzaddik doesn't have any of these menial tests at all. Gone beyond that. That's why that's, again, a gift from above. But he says we have to aspire to be the individual who lives in the real world and overcomes every moment of nisayon, of nisyonis, of tests. So that's a pretty high standard. That's now why you understand why the book's called Sefer Shel Beinonim, and that's what we have to try to get. So similarly, when we speak about Ahava Rabbah, to have that kind of ecstatic love where there's perfect states of unity that we constantly experience, that too is a gift from above. And it originates from the four realms. If we speak about the four realms of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, this love comes from the highest realm called Atzilus, and in the realm of Atzilus, there is no such thing as distinctiveness or separation. Everything is in a state of oneness. That's why this love originates at that particular level. But for you and I, we have to struggle with the other aspect of love. Absolutely. That's why it's not a subjective test. You know, being a Jewish person is not a subjective test, although historically we've had movements in Judaism that have decided to be subjective. Things like, well, all right, you know, Sinai took place 3,500 years ago, but we're modern people, we live in the modern world, and therefore we have to do things differently. That's a subjective test. But of course, Kabbalah doesn't follow that at all. Kabbalah says that there's a profound truth that's innate, that is able to transcend, to use the word that used down there, to transcend the time frame altogether. That whatever is a truth remains a truth, unadulterated by the progress and movement of history at all. Something we one day will perhaps get together and discuss a little bit more. So, if you're going to practice Ahavas Olam, at least that lower level of love, and it's not at least because it's actually a very high level when you want to consider it, what it means is you do not look at the externality. I don't love you because you dress beautifully. I don't love you because you've won the Queen pageant. I don't love you because you are the smartest person I've ever met. I love you much more profoundly. I have to learn to love you because through all the levels that you are, there's a profound essence that is intimately connected to me, where we are one with each other, and that is at a soul level. To practice Ahavas Olam, you have to be able to enter into states of oneness in the greatest profundity of the greatest depth, and that's your essence and my essence. From which comes a very interesting teaching which many psychologists have shared with parents in instruction on how to deal with your children. Never tell a child that the child is bad or the child is naughty. So what we're talking about here of some sort of laissez-faire attitude? Not at all. You don't focus on the person, you focus on the behavior. What you did was wrong. What you did was naughty, but not that you are naughty. Big difference. Because what is it that I love about you? Most profoundly, I love your essence. That always is essentially good. Always. I may not like what you said yesterday to me, and I may not like the way you behaved to me the other day, so I don't like your behavior on that occasion. I don't like your words, but I love you. That doesn't stop my love. Likewise, in a situation, a spousal relationship of husband and wife, a lot of husbands and wives mix this up. I don't like the way you speak to me. So what? Does that mean you stop loving the person because you don't like the words? I'm simplifying because it's more complex than that. But there is a truth there. We have to understand it. That goes to the core of what love really is. So it's not something external, it's not ego-driven, it's not based on my needs and my perceptions, etc. It's a profound spiritual connectedness and oneness. Now let's redirect that and all be mystics around the table. Let's extend that to the world. Let's extend that to the universe. You know what we love about this process called life? Because constantly I can be an integral element with the totality of existence. I can sit and contemplate that a God who is so totally removed from me that you can't even compare the figure 1 to trillions of trillions of trillions. Because when you say 1 and trillions, there's a relationship. Even though it's trillions and this is just 1, there's still a relationship. But when we speak about creator and created, there's no apparent relationship. It's so removed to the point that we don't even see the benevolence of the creative process in front of our eyes. You can't see the world being constantly recreated. You can't see this table being constantly recreated. It's all hidden. That's why that's the God of nature, the word Hateva, nature, which in Gematria is equivalent to the Gematria of Elohim, which is a name of God. It's the God of the hidden God. The illusion, the samsara, the surface, and truth lies much more profoundly within. So what we did this evening was to begin to introduce the subject of love. In so doing, we introduced, firstly, that there is a consciousness flow which emanates from the soul. We learned that there were two pathways that this consciousness expresses, through mind and emotion. We then had to define what mind and emotion is to a more literal sense. And then we discussed that emotions have two equal and opposite tendencies, love and fear, which are polar opposites in the way of their dynamics. And then we found that there was a duality even in the way they are expressed through lower self and higher self. And then we learned there was a duality in each because there's a higher and lower fear and a higher and lower love. And then we used some examples to make that explicit in the world. So we really covered a huge area. Although it's only half a chapter in the book of Tanya, and the book of Tanya has several hundred chapters, so I don't think we've actually covered that much from that point of view. But on the other hand, I'm sure that through our consideration of the points this evening, we at least have a taste of what it is that we have to progress in our own lives already after this lesson. Any remaining questions? Well, I certainly hope I haven't stunned you into silence here.
What about when Mashiach comes?
Yeah, that's a good point. What happens when Mashiach comes? In other words, will the nature of the human being change? I don't know. I usually tell people to stick around and find out. But the point is that there will be a change in the state of nature, the way we are taught. The Torah is very vague, deliberately vague about the Messianic period. And the reason is because if it becomes too concretized, then the way that we behave in everyday life becomes somewhat disjointed. But we are told, for example, and not about Mashiach, but in science, that right now we're using 5% of our brain. We are told, when Mashiach comes, so to speak, we'll use 100% of our brain. I know, perhaps. Could be well so. But it's a nice little metaphor, meaning that we're going to move from VFL to AFL. We're going to move from lower order to higher order, but it's going to be a quantum leap. Our perception of reality will change. But the reason I guess we don't spend too much time there, because at the moment to get there, we have to make sure we perfect ourselves in the here and now. And operating optimally in the here and now is really what it's all about. And then we can actually effect the changes that create all that. And if we fail, it'll happen anyway. But it says that we can accelerate the process through our own personal behaviors. Was noch? Any other questions that are unrelated to what we spoke about? As if we didn't canvass everything in the world tonight. Speak now, forever hold your peace. All right, so those of you who are gluttons for punishment, next week, same time, same station. My Aramaic is not great, but tata means lower, and why that should be the word in Aramaic, I cannot answer you. Aramaic is a corruption of Hebrew, as all languages are. Every language emanated from Hebrew as its origin, as a number of philologists have actually shown. That's why you can find Hebrew words. I had a driver who brought me here today. I ordered one of these taxis that takes wheelchairs. And his name was Abraham. And I asked him, knowing the answer where he's from, because his features were quite obvious, he said Ethiopia. And he started telling me about the words in northern Ethiopia that are so many Hebrew words that they actually use. One that comes to mind is the Ethiopian word for water is mai, and in Hebrew, maim. Yeah, there are many others also. In Hawaii, as I said last night for some of you who were here, I found an amazing number of words in Hawaiian that were very, very almost direct takes of Hebrew. So it's really quite interesting. I'm no longer surprised, yeah. Yeah, so that's also another take from Maim. So that's fine. That's okay. That just makes life interesting. When I taught grades 5 and 6 at Yeshiva College many eons ago, one of the things we did was, in study of Chumash, was a competition. Who could come up with the most English words that have direct, clear, semantic connection to Hebrew? They came up with hundreds. It was actually quite amazing. It was really, really good. Please stick around, have a cuppa, sit out there, and we'll have a chat more informally. Thank you for a lovely evening.
Thank you.